Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. Super excited to be handling today's webinar, our October webinar here for the New York City chapter of Products That Count. For those who I've not had the chance to meet in the past, my name is Dan Hammaker. I am the head of chapter for Products That Count here in New York City. I also work in product myself. My day job is as a senior director of product management at a company called Intap, where I work on software for large professional and financial services firms. Today, we are going to be continuing some discussions that we've had in the chapter recently around AI and talking specifically about some privacy considerations that come with working with AI, as well as general software applications that many of us are likely involved in. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by Shaifali Patel, an expert in these areas, and someone who brings a really strong background to the discussion. Shaifali, welcome. Thanks for making time to participate in the community and share some of your expertise with us. Do you mind just sharing a bit of an introduction on yourself?
Yeah, certainly. Definitely not an expert, but I would say learning a lot. I am currently working for an amazing community-based organization called JCC of West Manhattan. However, my background has really been in financial services, so it's a pretty interesting journey to where I am right now. But when you're in as you may have already know, that industry is heavily regulated. It always has been, even though I know data privacy has been super buzzwordy lately, but regulation and compliance has always been sort of the foundation of everything that we did in financial services. And I think from early on, you kind of learn that privacy is not about just regulations and compliance. It's really about building transparency and trust with your clients. So I think, kind of full circle to today's world where data and analytics plays such a heavy role especially with AI in the picture and in the most recent, recently becoming more commercialized and accessible for larger population. I think balancing privacy and AI has become really critical. And it is definitely a really complex issue with so many diverse opinions and perspectives. So I think for this conversation, I want to kind of narrow the focus, and I'll probably have a lot of repeated themes, and that's intentful because I think we need to stop making this so complicated and really take it to more common sense approach. So three things that I really want to highlight today is, your right to privacy. So let's kind of start there. What are some laws out there? Like, what are the rules that protect it? And then finally, how do we build technology? How do we start thinking about building technology that respects both your personal rights or individuals' personal rights and the laws?
Awesome. Yeah, I'm thrilled to get through that agenda, and I think
Yeah.
that's a really meaningful set of topics, and I appreciate obviously the kind of through line that you mentioned where, look, there's a lot of overlap here.
Yeah.
There's a lot that we have actually already established in the software community around privacy that continues to apply to AI and future technologies as the world keeps evolving. So I think it's great, that we'll be able to draw parallels between things that might sound repetitive, but are worth mentioning in different contexts.
Yeah.
Just for folks who are joining us today, we're going to tackle this in a fireside chat style, keep it more of a free-flowing discussion. And as part of that, we welcome any questions or comments throughout. So feel free to drop those in the chat as we're going along here, and we'll do our best to get to them. And then, if there's time, we'll reserve a few minutes at the end for Q&A.
Awesome.
Cool. So to get started, I think, we want to maybe make sure we're all on the same page about what it is that we're talking about while we're talking about privacy. Do you want to start there, Shaifali? Maybe just give us a bit of a definition around what privacy is
Yeah.
and ground us in that.
Yeah, and as I promised, I'm going to keep this less complicated. So while there's some amazing definitions out there of privacy, I think the one that has become like my favorite that I kind of tell everybody is from an 1890 article in Harvard Law Review that really simply put privacy as the right to be left alone. And that resonated really well with
Yeah.
me because, it's like at the end of the day, what are we looking to do? We're really trying to protect the personal freedom, right? Like the freedom of thought, the freedom of information. We're really trying to kind of prevent the intrusion as it feels in today's world of all of that. Like you're typing in, something in the search engine, somebody is now collecting that data. So it's that very real definition that really got me more curious, and really I think important to have these simple conversations and make this topic less complicated and more personal so that more people engage with it, the more we're going to have this continuous dialogue, which is really important.
Yeah, no, I love that. The right to be left alone. I think that's super crisp and cogent and easy to grasp. I do think, for a lot of PMs, though, they would probably find some gray area in that, right? I mean, I think we are probably all familiar with different types of usage tracking and metrics that are now at this point almost table stakes when it comes to product development and understanding the adoption and efficacy of your solutions. When we think about categories of data like that, and then maybe on the other end of the spectrum, things like personally identifiable information, PII, or of course, medical records and those sorts of things. How do you think about privacy in the context of some of those different data categories and where degrees of privacy may be respected in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, taking it, maybe expanding the definition that I was previously stating in a more digital world. So I'll kind of start there and then probably answer your question. I would say things to think about is, or as an individual, and I would say that privacy is not just responsibility of the companies, and obviously there's a lot of scrutiny and focus there, but as an individual, there's just a few things that you need to be really aware of and start kind of asking and questioning. So very simply, like, what information about me is being collected, who's collecting it, for what purpose, and who is it being shared with? And then do I ultimately have control where I can delete the data or, request for the data to be deleted or not shared. So I think those are kind of like some things to think about from a data subject or user perspective. And then I think when it comes to the product managers, I think all of the above, right? So making sure that you're being thoughtful about the data that you're collecting. Like, is this data needed for what I'm looking to do? Is for the objective of what I'm looking to do? Is this something that is it sensitive? Do I have proper encryption, security in place, right? Because there's a lot of responsibility that you take on when you hold somebody's data, and especially if it's a sensitive data. So I think those are kind of like some of the things that I would start in consideration, and there are lots of things that I mean, we'll probably like touch on privacy by design later on, but there's a number of things that you can kind of start thinking about from the get-go so that you can start implementing those controls in place.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think is a good framework when it comes to thinking about, different categories of data and things like that that are going to be important for those of us on the product side to be aware of as we're designing features. I know we're going to get into some of this a little bit later when it comes to privacy by design. But I think, there's obviously typically some interaction or some interface that comes into play that ultimately allows for this data to be captured and potentially leveraged in our solutions. How do you think about some of the considerations that PMs might want to take up front when it comes to feature design and things like that, and accounting for privacy? And I guess part of where my head is going is, some of the folks that we work with on our community are more B2C focused and others more B2B. We obviously have kind of different levels of data and different commitments to clients depending on the nature of them. How do we think about, some of those considerations in designing solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the reason I keep kind of going back to thinking about the individual is because I think that is really where we need to connect the dots. So, as you start designing the systems, some of the basic things would be like, turning things on and off, right? Like how modular are your data systems that you can, very quickly turn things off and on in terms of like, based on what the user consent is. So let's say I provided a bunch of my data, but then, I decided, hey, I don't want my birth date to be displayed or used anymore. So can I now, can we quickly turn that feature off where we're not collecting the data, and also, that data is no longer being shared or used in the application. So I think, and those controls could be like basic. There's also like, you could make it like more customized, more advanced. So it all depends on, how much control. And I think going back to the beginning when, where I was mentioning, like, how do we build the trust? So I think with so much conversation happening on data privacy and so many things, or so many like, recent episodes of, data breach and how these companies are using everybody's data, I think there's a lot of rightful, like, kind of scrutiny, but also fear that people have now on sharing their data. And I think that's obviously can work, very counterproductive, because if everybody turns off like all data sharing, then that's not going to be helpful either. But I think to earn that trust, we need to take those steps, where people feel like I am ready to share my data if I understand, and if I also feel like at any given point, I am going to ultimately own my data throughout this workflow, and I will have the control to, make decisions on how it will be used.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's super interesting, because I think that is something that is, at least in my experience, coming even more to the forefront with AI being incorporated into software. Because, obviously people see the promise of AI, they hear all about it, they're excited about it, but
Yeah.
people are also very aware of the other side to that coin, which is now you've got these sort of black box models taking information you share and potentially learning from it, right? We don't even know what that means in all cases, and how that data might be regurgitated and shared to another user or person who interacts with that model. So just curious, like for folks who are beginning to dip their toes in the AI waters, which I assume many are, when people are interacting with different types of models and thinking about, which might be right for their product, can you maybe just speak a little bit to some of the different considerations from a security standpoint that come with different models?
Yeah, I think what I want to do is like maybe a good segue into why all of this matters in terms of like, it's obviously the trust and, some of the transparency that we want to bring to the users is important, but I think it's also equally important to understand the regulation landscape is getting, well, it's broadening, first of all, and it's getting more and more strict because of, all the adversity that is surfacing with the use of data, and especially in the AI systems, because as we all know, AI systems need a lot of data, and often this data is collected in not a very lawful way, so it's a web scraped or, whatever it is. So there's a lot of questions being raised around that. And I think something to keep in mind as you're kind of entering this space is I think falling back on some simple principles that GDPR, which is the global data protection regulation that EU came up with in 2018. So they kind of are the leaders right now in that space in setting forth these guardrails. I would say four things that really kind of like the key things of this law, and the reason we want to highlight them and kind of keep them in mind is because there's a lot of other regulations that are coming that are really branching out of these four key principles. So one of them you already mentioned, Dan, which is transparency, right? Like we don't know what is really it's often called a black box because it's like we don't know what's happening. How is our data? How are these decisions being made? What is the algorithm? So all of that is so complex and nobody understands it. And I think that's part of the reason why, the transparency is important. And we all heard of terms like responsible AI and explainable AI. These are kind of like emerging terms, but they're not so emerging because that's always been the case that, this lack of transparency has always been there. Lawfulness is another one. So again, you're new in the space, you're, things to consider, right? So where are you collecting the data from? Is there proper consent in place for the data that you're using? There's a lot of laws and regulations that are coming pretty fast on making sure that there is a certain amount of consent, or not certain amount, like there's consent present. I think there's, things like breach of contextual integrity is a big one that has, happened in a lot of recent cases. Fairness is another one, right? Especially when you're building AI systems that are even HR systems that, are right now scanning everybody's resume. Like how fair are these systems in terms of the decisions that they're making? And then accuracy, I guess, is a big one as well, because we've all seen how AI does make mistakes. And I think that's where, people say like you have to have the human in the loop, and what does that mean? And and because I think that branches into even more of a Pandora's box of accountability. So now who's going to be held accountable? Is it the data? Is it the algorithm? Is it the human in the loop? So, all of these things are kind of really complex, but they're really important that we continue to talk about it and solve for.
Yeah. Super, super interesting. Yeah. And I think, begin to touch on some interesting topics that might be outside the scope of this webinar, but getting into, where some of that human AI interaction comes into play, and, how you balance capturing the data that you need to generate a good output from the human with their refinement of it and review ultimately. There's a lot to all of that is a lot for us to think about. But focusing on privacy, of course, I think getting into some of these rules and regulations, I know, there's a regulatory kind of branch that is doing its best, but we have technology that is off to the races and iterating and evolving at a speed that's hard to keep up with, for anybody, much less, the wheels of government. So if you were in a regulatory seat and needed to pick some of the highest value areas to spend your time and apply regulation, I'm curious, which ones would you choose at this point?
Yeah, actually, that is exactly what's happening. There's I think you've heard the EU is coming up with an AI Act, and that is actually what it's focused on. So based on it's giving different models, risk metrics, it's called. I think top of list, and to answer your question, I would say biometric recognition is is, huge, because that's obviously very personal, very sensitive data, has lots of repercussions. Healthcare and medical has always been up there. In US, we do have the HIPAA and, so many different guidelines. But I think those, and then I was also talking about HR and the hiring, those applications are also, they could lead to a lot of discrimination and just, bias if not regulated. And again, transparency is key. And I think a lot of the content creation, which is like the ChatGPTs and Gen AIs, as it's evolving, I think that is also becoming more and more into the focus area for when it comes to like regulations.
Yeah. And I know, like on the language model specifically, that there are some discussions about, licensing content and things like that for training, just to help, address some concerns around, I think, not just privacy, but also just, data rights and, plagiarism almost, in a sense. In your experience, curious how you see some of those considerations flowing down into the applications of those models. Because, it's one thing, for the model provider to be worrying about those things, but then for those of us who are seeking to develop new applications of those models, how do some of those considerations around where the models got their data and may get their data going forward need to be considered?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it depends. I think this even goes down to not only the consent, but also like, the accuracy and integrity, like, quality of the data, right? Like, how
Yeah.
was it generated? And I think contextual content matter in this case because, I think there was a case, as a matter of fact, where a law professor was actually wrongfully accused of sexual harassment. And that all led to, scraping some information that came in a context that wasn't relevant to whatever this decision model was doing. And I think it, obviously it leads to personal harm, but it also, raises so many other questions. So I think it's important to, the quality of your data is equally important. As to getting the consent. And then, I think when it comes to, because we hear things like, oh, data gets sold and, everybody's like sharing data. I think a lot of that is coming into spotlight. And I think that's something that, you should really consider. And this is the reason I think when, we talked about it earlier, that it's important to kind of have more modularity in your application and the way you build it, so that for whatever, unintentful reasons, you ended up collecting a set of data that, falls into, let's say, those gray areas. You can very quickly, remove them from your data set, or, so you don't have to kind of rework everything. So I think this is where, again, this has been around, like modularity and, modernization of data systems has been around for a while, but I think that's becoming more and more important as people, start building or start applying the data to the AI models that they're building.
Yeah, interesting. I think that's like the concept of modularity of data, it makes sense when you talk about it, but it also seems to run sort of in a contradictory way to the theme of big data, which was, the talk of a town maybe a decade ago, where, and a lot of firms, especially some of the ones that I work with that, are towards the tail end of the technological curve, folks are still in the process of aggregating a lot of the disparate data sources
Yeah.
from across their different applications and
Yeah.
subscriptions, that kind of stuff. So are you almost advocating for maybe putting a pause on that effort and keeping things in some silos?
Yes and no. I think maybe to clarify, I think big data is still important. I mean, big data really just means that, you have the ability to whether it's like a federated model or you're kind of putting everything in a data lake. But the idea is that, you don't, we've also seen scenarios where data lakes have become, what do they call them? Data swamps, right? Like,
Yeah.
because, and what does that even mean? So that really simply put means that you collected a lot of data, but you didn't categorize it. You
Mhm.
haven't, kind of like built those data dictionaries to and defined your data. You haven't made it accessible enough, right? It's just collecting a bunch of data and putting it in a data lake and calling it big data, like, calling it some label is not enough. I think it's collecting what's needed and then categorizing it properly. And I think that is where, putting controls, right? So labeling the data, like, is what is sensitive data, what is publicly accessible data that you may not need to put too much protection on, but then your sensitive data, hey, we need to, like, do penetration testing, like we need to do, check for vulnerabilities. Like, there's so many things that, you have to account for. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that is going to be becoming pretty fairly ubiquitous is providing the data subjects, and data subjects is really just the person whose data you're using. So almost all of them are all of us are data subjects, but providing timely information on how my data is being protected. So I think
Mhm.
those are kind of like the key considerations, but I don't think big data itself or collection of the data is the issue. Well, I guess it has other issues, but let's say if you have done it like in a respectful and mindful way. But then once you have that, what you do with that data is also really important.
Yeah. That's a helpful clarification. And if anything, it to me says there's almost a need to double down on that data, capture, classification,
Yes.
organization, cleanliness, etc., so that you've got everything clean, ducks in a row, like you said, avoiding the data swamp where now you've got a bunch of
Yeah.
poorly organized information. And if you do need to go retrieve something to show somebody, hey, this is what I have, you can let me know if you want to delete it, for example, in the case of GDPR.
Yeah.
You're able to do so in a way that's crisp and clean.
Absolutely.
That makes sense. Cool. Well, we've touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to talk a little bit about, building products that respect privacy. Ultimately, for those of us in product management, that's what we're
Yeah.
here to do. And that's a core part of our roles is ensuring that privacy is respected. So we touched on privacy by design a little bit, but I want to just dig in on that discussion
Yeah.
in more detail. And again, we've talked a little bit about an evolving technology space, an evolving regulatory environment. Do you have any tips for people to kind of future-proof their designs or their features to stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I mean, I think really boils down to, having user control, right? Like, do we have proper controls in place where the user feels they're in control of their data? They have the, ability to consent, not like even if they consented to something, they have the ability to come back and say, nope, I no longer wish to share this, or I no longer want to share this part of my data. So, kind of like some customized or some custom control settings around that, because the last thing you don't like you want to do is make it like and turn it, keep it like so limited that it's like an on and off, so because you can lose a lot of value, right? Maybe some users are not willing to share certain things, but they're maybe okay to share other things, right? Because, like, for example, like if I am using a navigation app, I have to share my location, so, but if when I'm like actually reading my email, I don't need to share my location, like, so I think those are kind of like some really basic common sense, and I use that word intentfully here because I'm like, it does really boil down to that. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I encourage my teams to do is, almost do like a design thinking session on what we're building, and, but really focusing on the data privacy and the user, sentiment in terms of like, how would my user feel about sharing this data, or what could be the sentiment of a user when I ask them for their birth date or their age or their gender or whatever.
Mhm.
I think that's one. And then we talked about ton about transparency, but I'm always going to repeat it because it's so important. So, it's like, how do we create more transparency in terms of like, what the application that we're building is going to do, and how, like, what are some key steps of it, what are some key considerations for it to make the decision. So just, how transparent can we build this system and explain to our users in a simple way. The other side of the transparency is, and I think I heard this in some talk that, it takes 30 days or something crazy like that for, if you kind of sit down and fully read Google's, like, the what do you call it, the agreement that you consent to every time. Like, it's that long. It'll take you like full 30 days to actually read the whole thing, because it's just huge and enormous, and there's no way that somebody has actually read the whole thing unless you had to. um and then on the other hand, if you read LinkedIn's um user consent agreement, it's very simple. It's written in a very accessible way. It's kind of like, broken down into like little pieces, like what, and exactly what what I was saying, like, what data is being collected, what are we going to do with this data, how can you, like, so they're I would kind of highly encourage, if you're curious, to check their data consent agreement out, because it's really it's kind of like the model that you want to follow.
Mhm.
And then protection and security, I think that's such a given in this environment. And cybersecurity is huge, right? Because everybody's now collecting so much data, and it's all about data. Um, there is a lot of scrutiny on, how this data is being protected. And then I think at the end of the day, the big conversation is going to be accountability. So if you think about, from a law perspective, businesses are considered an entity. So in the court, in the court, if you're suing a business, that business is actually treated like a person. So that's what the whole LLC and that thing is. But there is no, AI is right now not classified as anything. So where does that accountability stand? So I think that is a huge question, and I think these are kind of like the four things to really think through. And really ask, kind of develop almost like a checklist for each of them, like, what are we doing for each of these, and collect the data and use it for as you're building your application.
Yeah, that's I think really, really helpful guidance. And I like having some of those specific examples of, different types of models of kind of data enumeration and things like that that have been put forth, and not above borrowing things like that from the public domain.
Yeah.
Um, that's super helpful. So something I'm interested in, this came up actually in a live discussion that we had as part of our chapter in September. We were talking about AI agents, and a member of our audience asked about, who's going to deliver the agent that I'm using every day. Is it Apple, or is it, maybe Google through like Google search, or of course, they can do it through Android as well on your phone. But, basically the question was, is it going to be a hardware or software player? And we've been talking a little bit about, privacy in the context of B2B and B2C, and where there are some different considerations. But I think, especially when you toss AI into the mix in the B2C world, there's this like really interesting dynamic developing between the companies that can gather and store everything
Mm-hmm.
on your device, and then, the metas of the world that need to get that data off your device into their servers to process. Just kind of curious. I know this is, a tough one, but like, given your vantage point, how are you seeing some of these debates taking shape, and where do you see maybe the hardware or the software side having the upper hand?
Yeah, I mean, I think one like something similar to what you're saying, federated learning is being, kind of, I think Apple has already started using some of that. There's some considerations to that. I think because federated learning, while it is a step in the right direction for data from a data privacy perspective, because really what that means in a simple way is that you're keeping the data stays within that person's device. And the model is really just kind of accessing the data from where it is and learning from it. Um, and it's not being collected in a centralized server. So just the fact that your data is not moving anywhere is, obviously keeps it more secure. I think some of the things that are kind of coming up though with that, obviously the payloads, right? So there to make that call every time on individual devices, that's taking, that there is a lot of like payload and cost involved.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is, because there is no centralized server collecting the data, there's a lot of like issues coming up with control of, or not so much control, but like the integrity of the data that's being that the model is using, and sometimes it changes, and I think that kind of from a versioning perspective is becoming an issue. So there's like, pros and cons, and I think depending on, which side of the conversation you're on, like, you're always going to have something to say. And I don't think it's wrong, but I think it is, something that we need to continue to iterate on maybe, and think of, when it comes to how do we engage, we know that we need data for our AI models, but then how do we now work smarter in that sense to kind of take all these in consideration? And the second thing, I think, just in line of federated learning, there's something called differential privacy, which I'm actually still like, learning, but I think it's basically trying to, again, anonymization, kind of think anonymization when in kind of like the foundation of it. So, how do we derive the value from the data for the model to learn, but at the same time protect the individual's privacy. So that's like kind of, again, different technique and tools that are coming in play, that's helping to advance, the AI revolution, if you will, but at the same time, really keeping privacy, in the forefront, and kind of evolving how do we do a better job with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've heard too, that some people see some opportunities actually to apply AI to strengthen privacy, looking at kind of advanced encryption opportunities, or ways to kind of minimize the need to leverage user data by creating synthetic data, even, right? Just
Yeah.
like helping to turn the faucet a little bit down on the consumption of user data. Um, we talk about AI as this, sort of scourge for privacy, but maybe there's some applications where it can be beneficial. Just curious if there are any like those that are coming up in your discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I think nothing in like, particular, but I think everything is really right now tied to how do we balance, as our webinar titles, the need for, keeping up, or continuing the momentum of the AI innovation, because there's so many, some great things. As a matter of fact, I actually heard this speech, and it was really interesting perspective, like on all this data privacy and AI, and I think the point they were trying to make is, regulations, and having these having data privacy come in. So like sometimes it just feels like, that it's going to hinder everything and kind of put everything to standstill, because how do you license all of this data, and how do you get all this consent in place? And even when you talk about synthetic data, like, it still needs a certain amount of, like, learning to then start generating, content that feels real, but, obviously is not tied to any data subject. But so I think all of that keeping in mind, the interesting thing this person said in the talk was that, maybe look at it in a way that, all this data privacy that's kind of, is being required in the AI innovation world is, maybe it will stop some of this human manipulation, right? Like, so there's a lot of focus on, like, how do you take all this data and then manipulate behaviors and create, like, habit forming products. And maybe it kind of like stops or minimizes some of that and shifts the focus on things that really matter, right? Like, how do we shift the focus on greater good, or things that, are kind of beneficial for everybody in versus this heavy focus right now on, accumulating users and getting views. Like, I think there's a lot of shift needed on how, to your point, like, AI can really be used in a good way.
Yeah, I like that. I like that theme, and I like the idea of, reallocating our collective brain power a little bit to things that might
Yeah.
move the needle away from, views and likes and follows. Um, so that's great. I know we're a few minutes ahead of schedule, but I think that's a great note on which to open the floor to some questions. So as I mentioned earlier, if you've got any that come to mind, please feel free to drop them into our Q&A section here. I've got just a couple more while folks are thinking. So we talked a little bit about the hardware software dichotomy when it comes to individuals and B2B, or I'm sorry, in B2C contexts. But there's an analogy in B2B with on-prem servers. And this is actually something I was thinking about as I was getting prepared for today's session, because in the professional services space where I work, a lot of the investment banks, a lot of the law firms actually still have on-prem software and data, which might sound hard to believe for those of us who have been in SaaS now for a decade or more, but a lot of firms still out there running on-prem, and there's chatter out there about potentially doing a little bit more on-prem in the future, just to be absolutely sure your data doesn't get picked up by a model and recast elsewhere without your consent or permission. So just curious, like, do you have any thoughts on whether that could be a trend, or whether just some of these privacy challenges may become insurmountable to a point in the cloud where people decide, okay, enough of the cloud, I'm bringing things back in-house?
Yeah, I mean, I always have thoughts, Dan. No,
Yeah,
but that's a
appreciate
different topic.
that.
Um,
Glad we're here.
yeah, no, I think you're right, but I think it also goes back to, but I don't think it's going to be all or nothing. I think it's going to
Yeah.
be like a more of a hybrid model. And again, that goes back to how well you're categorizing. How well do you understand data that you collected, and how well did you classify, categorize it, label it, whatever you want to call it. Because I do see that super sensitive data may stay on-prem, whereas publicly shared data doesn't need to have, be on-prem, because there's a lot of costs associated with on-prem, as we all know, and I think more than cost, like, there's a scalability, there's flexibility, like, there's a lot of, like, pros and cons there, that I think, especially the startup community is, like, anybody who's thinking of a startup, the on-prem is going to be really hard for them to start with, because as it takes like months for data centers and servers to come together, and then you need so much resources to constantly supported, backups, like cybersecurity, like there's just so many things, and very heavy cost. But for the large organizations, I've already started seeing that trend, like, where we're actually starting to sort of keep more of our super sensitive data. I think in the banking world, that was always the case, that, we always had that population of highly sensitive data on-prem, and then, a lot of the other stuff, depending on the categorization, goes to different clouds. So yeah, I think it's more going to be a hybrid, and we'll see how that plays out. But again, these are the things that I feel like, our collective effort can go into using the AI, capabilities to help us solve some of these things. Like, how do we make cybersecurity, like, how do we encrypt encryption stronger? How do we like prevent all of this data breaches? So I think there's a lot of space in that topic, or there's a lot of room in that in that space to grow.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting. I'm curious to see how that plays out. It's been a push, I think, over the last several years, I would say, to kind of begin moving away from the on-prem, and like you said, just
Mm-hmm.
being to cut some of those costs that are inherent with hosting servers yourself. But again, the risk reward pendulum is always swinging as the
Yeah,
playing field changes, and like you said, I'm
yeah,
hearing the same, people starting to reconsider some of those trade-offs and bring more things back
yeah,
on
yep.
prem. I had another question. This is a little bit less AI related and more just general product management as it relates to privacy. So, so much of PM's role is that of organizer of stakeholders, right? And we're at the center of projects that include disparate teams, different disparate functions. Do you think about, operating with an emphasis on privacy, what sorts of stakeholder groups would you suggest that PMs pay special attention to ensure that emphasis is established?
Yeah, I mean, I think partnership, the obvious ones are like, partnering up with legal compliance, regulatory, teams, whether you outsource them or like, what, depending on the model. Definitely, kind of making sure that you understand um the the laws that govern around, like, especially if you're expanding into different markets globally, the evolution of the data privacy laws are growing day by day. Even we don't have a federal, obviously, law that governs it, but every state has, even in the United States, like, California being like the leader right now with the CCPA, but every state has started to bring forth some regulation and law. So I think making sure you understand, is, based on, like, what market are you trying to expand in, what is your user base, right? Like, so if it's like minors versus, like, adults, like there's so many different laws that pertain to different populations of users, and I think just really keeping all of those, or starting to kind of talk about all of those things, not in terms of just features and like things that you want to build, but making sure that you understand the regulations and the laws that are ever evolving, and then I think to answer your question directly, like, so just building better partnerships with some of these areas is really going to be key. And I think we really need to shift from viewing regulatory and compliance as a checkbox to really kind of putting yourself in the shoes of your users to say, okay, if I were this person, how would I want my data to be controlled? What would I feel, how would I feel if I didn't, for the lack of transparency, or if I felt like I can't trust this system enough to know what's going on, like, so I think a lot of people are starting to now question that, as the conversations are becoming more and more accessible and the laws are becoming, are coming up, I think it's important to know that this is no longer a checkbox. This is something that everybody needs to keep top of mind. Just as important as building a new feature, it's like, are we building this new feature in a way where, we're meeting the regulations and the privacy laws?
Yeah, no, I love that example or framework because it ties back to another core part of being a PM, right? Is just having that user empathy and trying to put yourself in the shoes of your end user, make sure you're,
Yep.
really thoroughly considering their perspective and evolving accordingly. I think, it also raises the interesting questions around, okay, when, what they want around trust and transparency might contradict what they want around ease of use and a decluttered UI, for example, right? Have you noticed any products that you think do a particularly great job of this? I know you named a couple of examples earlier for terms and conditions and documentation, but what about from like a UX standpoint? Anything stand out? Sorry, I know I'm putting you on the spot with this one.
No, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think, one of the things that I really, and I think any application that, allows for you to, obviously, when it comes to UX, like, just ease of like, getting to what you need. And some of that is important, but I think more and more it's becoming important that, how quickly can I get my, transaction completed? And I think a lot of users are also becoming more and more, myself included, sort of like, hesitant in providing more information than needed. So if I have to like I think for me personally, if I have to, if I'm signing up for, let's say, something, and if it's asking me for like 10 different data points, I'm not going to complete that process because at this point, I'm really just exploring. I just want to I'm getting to know you, right? And see what services you have to offer. So I think that's really important. Maybe I'm bringing up another, context here that, the layering of like, okay, how do you treat your brand new, like, explorers or, people who are just exploring your application to like, hey, somebody's now signed up. So now you may need more information with them on them. And then somebody's now like this loyal customer that's been with you for, a year, 2 years, whatever. So I think maybe gradually thinking about like how much data you want to collect at what point is really important, because personally, when you asked that question, I was like, how do, and then immediately it came to my mind that, oh yeah, you know what, if I have to give more than 2-3 data points to just get started, I lose interest. I'm like, no, this is like too much, or not worth my time.
Totally. Yeah. It's like, do you really need my phone number for me to use this like
Yeah,
online
exactly.
thing?
Yeah.
No, yeah, that's a really good answer. And yeah, I think I like that idea of sort of progressive capture as you are showing sort of progressive adoption and also as it's needed, right? Obviously, in many
Yeah,
cases, some folks
exactly.
are
It,
never
it it goes to
really.
the basic principle that, like minimize data collection, right? Like, so do
Yes.
I really need this data at this point of time? And maybe that helps not only the user journey, but, maybe building the trust.
Yeah. Um, it raises something else that I've seen in some of my own work and I've talked to our clients about. I've seen, in other companies that I've worked at, which is, the idea of kind of building holistic profiles. And a lot of companies, some of the biggest CRMs out there, especially like Salesforce and HubSpot, they've built value propositions on the idea of uniting your marketing data, whatever you're capturing from your form fill outs, your email engagement, that kind of stuff, with your usage data that might be piped in from something like an Amplitude or otherwise captured with whatever else your sales team knows from their profiling. And so you've got this like complete picture of a person, but from these disparate sources that might have disparate standards around data collection, and maybe even different regulations against which they're judged. So just curious, like how should firms and PMs be thinking about the way that data gets leveraged, and are there any special considerations when you know the data is coming from these different types of sources?
Yeah, I mean, I think my, maybe there's other considerations, but I think my mind always goes to, like, when you say different sources, how well do you know these sources? Like, do you own these sources? Is it coming from a third party? If it's coming from a third party, how did they acquire the data? I think there's a lot of things that should be just weeded out right from the beginning. And while I think a lot of that information is important, like, could be useful and important, I'll go back to the contextual, point, like when this information was, in what context was this information created or collected? And if you're not using that data for the rightful purpose it was, created for, and if that purpose is now shifting to something else, that from a lawful perspective, it's considered breach of, or breach of contextual integrity. So I think again, while there's no firm laws and things are really gray right now, I feel like that is quickly evolving, and building those things from the beginning, I think will kind of save you right down the lane when these regulations come hard and heavy. And then you're kind of scrambling to then undo a lot of these things. So
Yeah, I think that's really good guidance. And I know we're almost at time. That might be a good note on which to end. So
great.
thanks so much again for joining us, Shaifali. I really appreciate it. This has been a super insightful conversation, and I appreciate everybody who has made time to join us. We are going to be back next week with another webinar on how product managers can use AI to save a little bit of time in their day-to-day jobs. So please join us for that if you're free. Otherwise, we'll look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. But thanks again, Shaifali.
Thank you, Dan.
Everyone.